Welcome, everybody. I think we are very excited to launch this webinar series with Professor Silvia Lindtner. But we'll just start by introducing a bit about the whole webinar series of innovation, automation, and digital economy of Sci-Tech Asia. So this series will be showcasing cutting-edge work in anthropology and the social studies of science and technology, understanding the larger ethical, social, and political dimensions of contemporary landscape of innovation, automation, and the increasing digitization. It brings together critical ethnographic research focusing on recent development of those technology or innovation-related tensions in China, South Korea, and Pacific Rim. So one of the goals of the series is to foster our better understanding of the challenges faced by contemporary, highly technologized societies through comparative social science research. The whole series is supported by the research cluster Technoscience, Society and Environment of CIAS, Research Center for Anthropology and Health at the University of Coimbra. And today's talk is by Professor Silvia Lindtner, which is based on his award-winning book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation. So I'll give a brief introduction of Professor Silvia Lindtner. Silvia Lindtner is an associate professor in the School of Information and director of the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing at the University of Michigan. She draws from more than 10 years of multi-sided ethnographic research, exploring China's shifting position in the global political economy of technology production, economic development, and science and technology policy. So her book reviews how a growing distrust in Western models of progress and development, including Silicon Valley and the tech industry after financial crisis of 2007 to 8, shaped the vision of China as quote unquote a new frontier of innovation. Her work contributes to the fields of science and technology studies, cultural and feminist anthropology, China studies, human-computer interaction, global communication studies, science and technology policy and design. Her research has been awarded support from the US National Science Foundation, IMLS, Intel Labs, Google Anita Borg, and the Chinese National Natural Science Foundation. So without further ado, I will pass the stage to Professor Silvia Lindtner.
Thank you so much, Yijan, for the kind introduction and also for making this whole event possible today. And so thank you for hosting me, and thank you to the whole Sci-Tech Asia network for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the other talks in this webinar series. It sounds super exciting, and I'm absolutely delighted to share with you today some of the key concepts and stories from my new book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation. As Yijan was just mentioning, the book draws on over 10 years of ethnographic research, out of which I spent 5 years full-time in China. And so in my talk today, I'll be weaving together specific stories and research sites to examine the role that technology production plays in contemporary governance in China. So also draw some connections to some of the ongoing debates around technology and governance in China today. The book and also the talk today, one of my key aims is really to challenge some of these more common portrayals of China as either a threatening player when it comes to technology, or as some region that just recently innovated. So I hope to intervene in both of these narratives. And instead, I really hope to show you today that a study, and specifically an ethnographic study of technology production in China, has much to say, for instance, not only about what is going on in China today, but also about histories of colonialism and even ongoing forms of power and transnational forms of control, and even Western imperialism. So sometimes this sounds counterintuitive when we talk about technological promises of innovation. You know, it still carries a kind of positive connotation with it, but I really want to sort of unpack how some of these promises of technology innovation often mask various forms of violence that actually are part of sort of the technological project as well. So that will be a key underlying current in the talk today. But to introduce all of this, I want to begin with this image here. So what you see here on the screen is a photograph of one of China's first hacker spaces, or maker spaces, as they were also often referred to. This place is called Chaihuo in Chinese. It is a very small space, about 15 by 10 square meter room on the second floor of a refurbished factory building in a creative industry park in the city of Shenzhen, so in the south of China, just north of Hong Kong. Chaihuo is, like many maker or hacker spaces like it, a very small community space that provides its members with free access to low-cost machines, open source tools, with the aim to allow people to tinker with electronics. So these kinds of maker spaces have proliferated in the thousands around the globe, not only in China, but really around the globe in the years following the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. These kinds of hacker spaces were not the spaces frequented by hackers often portrayed in the media. So think about man illegally accessing information or breaking security barriers. On the contrary, the kind of hacking that took place in maker spaces like Chaihuo was a project of self-transformation from a passive consumer into a so-called maker. So somebody who intervened in social, economic, and political processes via technological experimentation and tinkering. So people who identified with this form of technological tinkering and making produced prototypes that made this very promise of intervention concrete. So they made things like the DIY, the do-it-yourself cell phone that you can see here on the screen, that would show you that you and I, rather than a big corporate player like Apple, can control the design and inner workings of your communication devices. Or they open up proprietary health devices like this one here to demonstrate how you can regain ownership of your body's data. So what you see on the screen is a hacked glucose meter that sort of created an artificial pancreas, a closed loop, where people gained control over the kinds of data that devices like Dexcom would record about blood sugar levels. So this project here really was meant to sort of hack not only devices, but also control over one's own body. And they made open source 3D printers. So the 3D printer, the open source 3D printer is often sort of a quintessential example of this so-called maker movement. The 3D printer really made palpable how you and I can mass produce in your own home. So these sort of prototypes of intervention, in other words, demoed how to see oneself as capable of intervening in things like industrial production, automation, and even broken healthcare systems that would keep data closed from their patients and users. These prototypes of intervention, so to say, created a feeling of being able to intervene at scale from the individual body all the way to national and globalized industrial production. They promised, in other words, to return the means of production to the people. In 2012, the former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, Chris Anderson, celebrated this promise in his book on the topic as follows. This is a quote: "The ability to manufacture local or global at will is a huge advantage. That simple menu option," and he refers to a 3D printer here, "compresses 3 centuries of industrial revolution into a single mouse click. If Karl Marx was here today, his jaw would be on the floor. Talk about controlling the tools of production. You can now set factories into motion with a mouse click." So Anderson's book was one of many other prominent writings on the topic of making at that time that drew heavily on socialist imagery and language. You see the reference to Karl Marx here. These writings claimed that making would would bring and return control to the people, that it would democratize industrial production, and that making was a tool to achieve social justice and even undo large corporate monopolies. So quite different though from Karl Marx, who understood alternatives to capitalism to emerge, of course, from class struggle and the collectivization of workers. These writings here portrayed individual self-actualization as desirable. So notably here too, when you look back at the quote on the screen, Anderson describes making's transformative power as stemming not from a collective, from a we, but from many individuals, like you can now set factories into motion, right? So that the power is sort of individualized here. In other words, these writings and projects, like Anderson's and other prominent maker advocates at that time, construed one of the core techniques of neoliberal governance, the framing of the self on economic terms, as something that was desirable and is a key to enabling social change. I call this in the book the socialist pitch. They produced, on first glance, what seems to be an inherent contradiction. Pitching is typically associated with a startup's ability to formulate itself as attractive to venture capital by producing a feeling of exuberant excitement and a promise to scale. The socialist pitch, as you can see here in this quote by Anderson, derives its power from this technique of producing an affect, a feeling of exuberant excitement and buy-in, by drawing specifically on the language and the image of social change and social justice. So pitching typically, of course, works through promise rather than actual change. So venture capital investors, for instance, fund ideas and prototypes of intervention rather than finished products. And so the socialist pitch is aimed not at social justice per se, but at creating a feeling that technological intervention itself is social justice. So Chaihuo Makerspace, with which I began, had become a well-known member of what prominent figures like Chris Anderson had pitched as a global movement that would return power and control to the people. So this is not the kind of space where one would expect to find the Prime Minister of China on an official state visit. And yet, as surprising as it seems, Premier Li Keqiang did indeed visit Chaihuo Makerspace and endorsed its prototypes of intervention on an official state visit in January 2015. And this is a photo here that was used in state media to document the visit. During the visit, Premier Li Keqiang declared that makers show the vitality of entrepreneurship and innovation among the people, and that such creativity will serve as a lasting engine of China's economic growth in the future. The premier's visit to Chaihuo was documented vividly by state media, and you can see some of these images here on the screen. The government website, for instance, posted a photo essay that portrayed Li Keqiang surrounded by a crowd of young Chinese men who showed off their latest technological creations. And so the photos also really showed, and I think you can see it here, a highly personable premier. So a politician who appeared to enjoy mingling with the group of young men. The message was that the prime minister was himself a maker at heart and a politician who was invested in empowering citizens to make things happen. Most importantly, though, the endorsement of makerspaces like Chaihuo by the CCP, by China's Communist Party, positioned these young men depicted side by side the prime minister as model makers, so as young Chinese engineers who had transformed themselves via the socialist pitch into entrepreneurial change makers. So people who would, by prototyping themselves, also prototype the nation anew. And this is a theme that it will unpack throughout this talk. So how this prototyping of the citizen into an entrepreneurial change maker is also deeply intertwined with this promise of prototyping a new, hopeful, optimistic China. So only a couple of months after the prime minister had returned to Beijing, he announced a new national policy that escalated making into a nationwide project. The policy was specifically written around three key terms, which translate sort of into English as mass makerspace, mass entrepreneurship, and mass innovation. And these terms were important because they really framed the policy's key directive, which called upon provincial, municipal, and district level governments to allocate their existing resources towards the setting up of these so-called mass makerspaces modeled on Chaihua. So the policy was aimed, so to say, at cultivating a maker's spirit amongst the masses. So a spirit that would in turn help foster an attitude of self-making and self-entrepreneurship. This is how the policy documents themselves had framed it. So in other words, the policy held up making as a technique, as a technology of self-transformation from an economic actor into an entrepreneurial actor. So in my book, Prototype Nation, I offer an ethnographic study of making for what it can tell us about the role that technology plays in contemporary governance in China. I specifically explore how the promise of democratized tech innovation as championed by maker advocates became a technopolitical instrument of affect that served the Communist Party state's broader interests to reposition China as a forward-looking and innovative nation. Crucially, I show that this project mobilized feelings of optimism, positivity, and happiness in the very moment that China's Communist Party feared social and political instability due to what was commonly referred to as China's first significant economic slowdown since the economic opening reforms in the 1980s. So by prototype nation, then, I mean the stipulation that a nation can and should function as a prototype, that a nation and its citizenry serve as the raw material for a new model. So for instance, China as modeling an alternative to Western approaches of technology innovation and economic development. So I use the prototype as an analytical concept grounded in practices of technology production and design themselves. As anthropologist of technology Lucy Suchman highlights, the prototype has particular performative characteristics within the work of technology design. It is, on the one hand, a material and concrete proposal of alternative ways of thinking about technology and its role in the world. So not simply as a matter of talk, but as a means for trying this proposal out. So in other words, the affective qualities of the prototype lie in its simultaneous functioning as both an object, a model, a demo of something, and a process, experimentation, testing, tinkering. So the term of prototyping then refers to both the normative modeling, so the making concrete or realizing of specific ideas, and the making of an alternative, which carries also the potential for contestation and intervention. So when we go back to the maker movement, one of the key promises of the maker movement was that this process of prototyping, so the testing and modeling of a technological alternative, was no longer reserved for elites, let's say for scientists, for designers, for engineers. And so in the book, I show how it was this very promise of democratized innovation that also reproduced normative notions of what constitutes the right model. And this is something I will unpack throughout this talk today. So the idea that a nation can function as a prototype, a way of modeling a new way of life for others, is of course not new. It is historically constituted through projects of modernization, economic development, and colonization. And so I want to remind us here of the work of the historian Arif Dirlik, who has argued that the European invention of the nation state was the ultimate vehicle of modernity. In other words, the European nation was positioned itself as a prototype of modern progress and economic development, with Europe framed as the archetype, right, as the ultimate prototype. And other regions, of course, were construed as in need to learn from the Western model nations. And this way process, of course, has influenced decades of post-colonial studies. And Arif Dirlik is like one of the people, of course, who has like worked in the space for quite some time. So, but what I really want to argue for here is that this colonial project of prototyping a certain way of life endures through the ideals and practices of contemporary technology innovation. So we often don't think technology innovation to have anything to do with past like colonial history. And my argument, and what I hope to show you today, is really how those two are very deeply intertwined. colonial past and especially racialized forms of violence, I argue, reverberate through the prototype nation. And to show exactly how this unfolds is really a key task of the book, Prototype Nation, and also something I want to do today in this talk. I want to highlight that this is really a feminist ethnography that weaves together sensibilities from critical race, post-colonial, and also science and technology studies. And in doing so, attending to bodies and sites that were excluded from this reinvestment in the nation and in certain people and regions with the exuberant feeling of excitement and future making and building sort of this great nation of China. And I'll unpack specifically sort of stories of exclusion and violence today in the talk. So to come back to Prime Minister Premier Li Keqiang, so it was no coincidence that Li Keqiang endorsed this makerspace Chaihua that was located in the city of Shenzhen, rather than any of the other hundreds of such makerspaces that have operated in China at that time. So the same year of Li Keqiang's visit to Shenzhen, Wired magazine had published this issue that you see here on the screen that claimed that it was now time to copy China. And in this special issue, there were a series of essays about technology innovation in the city of Shenzhen. So Shenzhen itself was kind of this hub that was celebrated in Western media as a challenge to Silicon Valley and a place that actually the West should learn from. So the cover, of course, here features a story of Lei Jun, the founder of Xiaomi, a mobile phone company that had grown out of what many people had begun referring to as Shenzhen's unique innovation ecosystem. And this cover here that you see by Wired magazine was really the culmination of a whole series of Western media coverage at that time about Shenzhen that had, within the time span of only a few years, rewritten the region in the global tech imagination. So what had long been decried and critiqued as a site of mere execution of Western ideas, as a site of low quality and copycat production, was suddenly celebrated as the Silicon Valley of hardware, as a hothouse of innovation, as where the future hardware entrepreneurs would go and even outcompete Silicon Valley. And these stories really proliferated in the years following the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. And it's really important to be very historically specific here. So why were these stories about Shenzhen proliferating at that time in Western media? The years following the crisis of 2007 and 2008 were marked by a broader reckoning with the complicity of technology in things like labor exploitation, resource extraction, and capitalist expansion. You can just see some of these images and books here on the screen that were released in the years following the financial crisis. So this wasn't only scholars, but a growing number of news media that began warning about the costs of ruthless neoliberal capitalism and the precarious conditions of work that it had created. And increasingly, people criticized Silicon Valley as a central culprit in this very destabilization. So in the book, I argue that China as a prototype nation, as a contested alternative to Western approaches to technology innovation, was co-produced by this specific techno-crisis thinking that was particularly pronounced at that time in the United States. We now, of course, often refer to this as the techlash, but it really began sort of in the years following the 2007 and 2008 crisis. So this was a moment when the tech industry and Silicon Valley in particular found itself confronted with a growing suspicion that the values it had propagated since the 1990s, so this countercultural ideal of tearing down hierarchies and in the hierarchies' place creating peer-to-peer and collaborative societies, as Fred Turner, for instance, has described it, that this very ideal had really only benefited a small minority. And of course, on the screen here, you see the iconic image of that countercultural vision, Apple's 1984 ad for the Macintosh computer, which sort of crystallized this kind of sort of countercultural sort of ambition. So it was in this moment of a broadening suspicion of who actually really benefited from this promise, right? And that for most people, this hadn't really materialized. So it was in this moment of doubt that China, and more precisely the city of Shenzhen, were re-articulated by a range of actors in the global tech industry as a place where the future was now made as newly innovative. And it was presented as newly innovative exactly because it had long been, and even continues to be, understood as not modern, as not innovative quite the same way as the West. So let me give you some examples of this. In 2014, Choi Ito, the at that time still director of the MIT Media Lab, traveled with a group of his students and faculty to the city of Shenzhen. And upon his return, he gave this infamous TED talk where he argued that traveling to Shenzhen was like going back in time and learning from the past, momentarily reliving the foundations of Japan's technological and economic success. Or this is another example here of a quote from an investor and director of an incubator program that was funded through Silicon Valley, but had set up shop in Shenzhen in 2012, where the European director here framed this as, you have people here in China that bring it down to business and where people make it happen. So this is about what's really happening in Shenzhen today. So we are really going boldly where no man has gone before. And usually when I have a live audience, I would ask who is recognizing this quote here, because of course, the investor here is referring to the pop sci-fi series Star Trek, of boldly going where no man has gone before. And I argue that this sort of casual reference to Star Trek is not to underestimate in this context, actually, as a narrative of American frontierism. References to Star Trek were something that I frequently encountered doing my research in Shenzhen at that time. And these references really legitimized an engagement with China broadly, based on a masculine and colonial narrative of adventure, of exploration, of technological mastery. So if space was the final frontier to be mastered by individuals empowered by the latest technological advances, China here was framed as the untamed land of copycat, to be mastered, so to say, by the maker turned entrepreneur, the maker who would turn himself into an entrepreneur, who would attract venture capital investment and so on and so forth. So in 2013, I spent a year embedded as an ethnographer in one such foreign-funded incubator program in Shenzhen. And the promotional materials of the program claimed that it was taking the maker movement to the next level, that it invested in makers whose prototypes promised to scale into products. So things like data-driven solutions, robots and drones, smart systems, Internet of Things, wearable technologies. This particular incubator was backed by a Silicon Valley venture capital firm that had strategically located its headquarters in Ireland for tax reduction purposes. And the investors and managers that ran the incubator were a group of powerful white men who were well known in the circles of global capital investment. They deliberately, in their promotional materials, in terms of how they pitched their own enterprise, the incubator, appropriated socialist imagery of China's past to really frame and present and pitch the location of the program in Shenzhen in revolutionary terms. So the promise here was that if makers embedded themselves into the city's electronic markets and its factories, they would learn how to become real-world entrepreneurs. They would no longer just tinker with electronics in a basement or in a makerspace, but they would actually hack economies of scale. They would hack global supply chains and even capitalism itself. That was the promise, and that was one of the key draws of a lot of young people into these incubator programs who were very idealistic about the maker movement and who really wanted to make a difference, right? People who were committed to justice and social change. So in chapters 4 and 5 of the book, I show in much detail how this socialist pitch of the entrepreneurial life in Shenzhen that refashioned colonial discourses of frontier making, of mastery and control, operates as what STS scholars call a market device of finance capitalism. So as a market device, this socialist pitch remoralized the economization of humans and things. So the economization of life, of course, is the idea that life itself should serve the interest of markets and of economic development. And here, the economization of life, so this very process that life should serve, that all of our interests should serve the growth of markets, was portrayed as something that is hopeful and as something that would provide individuals with a hacktivist kind of agency. So in this particular political and economic regime of technology innovation, capitalist expansion, so to say, is pitched as being participatory, as available to everyone by drawing specifically on this language of making and hacking and social justice. So processes of capitalist expansion, in other words, no longer appear as a natural consequence of competition, but rather appear to be hackable, something we can make our own. So in other words, the neoliberal doctrine of inevitability, so the idea that capitalist expansion is something that is automatic, something that is natural, that we can't really change, right? This idea, the sort of notion of inevitability, is imbued here with a feeling of agency. So in other words, economic life is framed as entrepreneurial life. So during my ethnographic engagement with this incubator, I spent much time with two women, Sophie and Mei Yun, who were hired as staff workers, both of them Chinese, and who were a key asset to the incubator. This is how the director of the incubator introduced the two Chinese women on the first day of the program. He said, "There's a thing about Sophie and Mei Yun. They are the office managers. They make our lives better. They will make sure shit works around here. If it doesn't work, just remember it must be their fault. Repeat after me, nothing is my fault, it must be their fault. When shit is broken, talk to them." So this introduction to the two female staff workers really set the tone for how the startup teams would approach them over the months to follow. So the job of these two women was really to help guide the startup teams through the emotional ups and downs of their entrepreneurial labor in Shenzhen. So when shit was broken, the two women would literally fix it. When the stress level amongst the startups went up, Sophie and Mei Yun would provide distraction and think of fun leisure activities. Their responsibility was really, unlike the startups, to stay in the background, to be caretakers, to take care of the program's day-to-day functioning and the startup's well-being. And it also included the labor to organize factory tours. So factory tours were really important for these mostly foreign startups, not only to build relationships with potential partners in manufacturing, but also to produce this kind of promise and feeling of entrepreneurial life that many had come to associate with the city of Shenzhen, as I was describing it earlier. So this feeling that if you embed yourself into Chinese factories, into Chinese supply chain networks, people would also be able to hack and intervene on a scale of the political economy that seemed typically out of reach for the average designer and hacker. So these factory tours really made that promise concrete, and Sophie and Mei Yun organized many of these factory tours and brokered these kind of relationships on behalf of the startups. So over the years of research in Shenzhen, I met many young women and also some young Chinese men hired into positions not unlike Sophie and Mei Yun. They were hired to perform what I call happiness labor, which is the work that goes into producing a feeling of optimism and cheerful delight. So it is not unlike what Arlie Hochschild has described as emotional labor, but it is more specifically to the tech industry. It's this kind of labor that a range of new organizational models rely on. So think incubators, co-working spaces, makerspaces, open innovation labs. These tech organizational models rely on this kind of labor in order to sustain their own precarious conditions of work that they demand of the startups and of this kind of entrepreneurial life that they celebrate as promising. So happiness labor, in other words, allows the entrepreneur to sustain a good feeling about technology, despite this increasing realization that for many, the self-investment will actually never pay off. So many of the young women and men that I found employed in jobs like Sophie and Mei Yun's jobs spoke fluent English, which they had acquired either through college training, so highly educated, or through rigorous self-study. And many of them were also severely underpaid, so they often were paid about the same or even less than the migrant workers employed in the electronic factories in Shenzhen just next door. So over time, this kind of happiness labor that was part of Sophie and Mei Yun's work became normalized amongst the startup teams. They began relating to them as friends and saw their labor as a form of peer production. So this revision of Sophie and Mei Yun's role from a worker to a peer, I argue, is really important to pay attention to, because it basically masks the gendered division of labor at the incubator and the uneven positionality between the firm's female employees and the mostly male and mostly white entrepreneurs that it invested in. So following the 2015 government initiative, so remember in 2015, Prime Minister Li Keqiang announces this new government initiative on mass making. So following that initiative that called upon regional governments to invest in these so-called makerspaces, spaces like the Silicon Valley funded incubator, where I conducted my field work, became a model of sorts for a gradual but massive urban upgrade, not only in Shenzhen, but in many other cities in China. In Shenzhen specifically, it meant that old production sites, so Shenzhen's electronic markets, depicted here on the left, for instance, were redesigned to look more and more like the incubator program and the makerspaces that the government had identified as cultivating these kinds of entrepreneurial makers that were promising for the nation. So this aesthetic upgrade of the city, I argue, was really meant to build what I call the entrepreneurial factory. So the entrepreneurial factory operates by producing feelings rather than products. So what do I mean by that? It is aimed at inducing in workers and engineers who are employed in advanced manufacturing, industrial production industries in China, the desire to see themselves as passionate change makers, as entrepreneurial innovators. So in other words, to turn themselves from engineers and manufacturers into entrepreneurial assets on behalf of the nation, and to serve the party state's own interests in industrial upgrade, like the Made in China 2025 initiative that was really important at that time, but also to sort of self-sacrifice and entrepreneurialize yourself for global development projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So the entrepreneurial factory really operates alongside what the autonomous and feminist Marxists have called the social factory. So the social factory is this concept to describe how capital subsumes various aspects of social life for the purposes of accumulating value. So I use the concept of the entrepreneurial factory to demonstrate that it's not only true that factory-like conditions are seeping into ever more corners of our lives. So think about Uber drivers, these various forms of gig work and tech labor, where factory-like conditions almost are like really becoming pervasive. So I'm arguing the entrepreneurial factory as a concept to show that the inverse is the case as well, that factory work itself and people who work in manufacturing are increasingly called upon to work in ways that is extractive, but that is sort of common to the Silicon Valley type industries. So factory work itself is increasingly shaped, in other words, by the kind of exploitation we see in the creative and tech industries, which is this normalization of overwork, of startup, precarious types of labor, of self-sacrifice, of taking big risks. And it's now asked of people like factory workers and engineers. So in my research, I followed several young men working in manufacturing in Shenzhen who the entrepreneurial factory enrolled in order to understand how it affected them. And one of these people was Robin, who is depicted here on the screen. When I first met Robin, he was 30 years old. He had moved to Shenzhen based on the urging of a relative. He moved from a rural part of China, and this relative had helped him obtain a fellowship at a local manufacturer and to leave behind a life in agriculture, which is the story of many people in Shenzhen. I stayed in touch with Robin over the years. In 2016, he invited me to visit his office at the outskirts of the city. And you can see a photo here of us having tea together. And while we had tea, he told me about an exciting new business opportunity. A childhood friend from his hometown in rural Hunan had opened up a shoe factory in Ethiopia. The idea was that Robin would get a section of that shoe factory in Ethiopia to have some of his own products assembled there. The shoe factory's promotional materials that Robin showed me that they signaled more than just an attractive business venture, echoing some of the official rhetoric of the CCP around its Belt and Road Initiative. The story here was really one about mutual growth and win-win, with China's own history of rapid economic development framed as a model for Africa. And Robin, though, explained to me that there was no direct government support. The expectation, he told me, was that people like him, so people who wanted to become these kinds of entrepreneurs, would self-invest by going out, or 出去 in Chinese. So the personal and professional risks of going out, of starting a sort of entrepreneurial business in Africa could be quite high. And yet people like Robin, like in my conversations with many of these young men, many of them understood going out to be as a potential to redeem China. So not just to redeem themselves, but to redeem China from a place that was known for fake and low quality production into a place that was known globally for cutting edge innovation. And they understood that this project would be possible if they transformed themselves. So if they transformed themselves from all the way from, a backwards farmer to a factory owner into eventually a globally savvy tech entrepreneur. So in the words of Robin, as he told it, this is a matter of feeling responsible. He said, in Shenzhen, people push you to go further, but our responsibility, our mission also becomes a burden. We are responsible for many workers, and this makes us feel like we cannot stop, we cannot let go. So a year later, when I returned to Shenzhen again and met with Robin, he had moved into a new office located in one of Shenzhen's newest and most prime real estate, Shenzhen Bay. And you can see a photo of the buildings here of Shenzhen Bay. As we sat in Robin's new office, 30 floors up this modern high-rise overlooking a pristine golf course landscape, he showed me his, and you can see it here on the screen, his video conferencing system that he had set up, and the photos from his latest trips to Ethiopia and Kenya. And as he was showing me all this, and he was clearly very proud, he suddenly interrupted himself and said, "This is not it. This is not it." He said, "I envy you, Silvia. You are respected no matter where you go. When I go to Africa, or if I went to the United States, I'm not respected. That's why we still have aspirations. That's why we hope to be respected. This is my goal. I'm pursuing this goal. That's why, although today I could have a really good life, I'm still living the life of a loser." So I argue that the entrepreneurial factory runs exactly on this promise of the good life that Robin here also invokes, which is continuously postponed for many Chinese men like Robin, deemed low quality and still not representative of China's modern ambitions, and especially for many Chinese women who are relegated to happiness labor, as I was describing it earlier. So a couple of days after my visit, Robin sent me with much excitement a WeChat message with the following news clipping from the Daily Mail in the UK. And the headline read, "Shenzhen, China's reform pioneer, leads tech revolution." And not without a hint of pride, Robin directed me to read till the end of the article, where it featured him right next to one of the American investors, who you can see here on the left, who had begun playing an active role in the city. I argue that it is this attachment to whiteness that promised happiness and that promised for a man like Robin to overcome experiences of racism in this present moment that made people like him, who I encountered in China's manufacturing industry, to endure, to kind of accept the violence of the entrepreneurial factory that demanded of people like Robin to take a lot of risks, by going to Africa, for instance, to self-economize, to overwork, and to take responsibility on behalf of the nation and the party state. I built here on the critical race and feminist scholar and philosopher Sarah Ahmed's notion of the promise of happiness. This is a quote from Ahmed. The civilizing mission of the colonial periods could be described as a happiness mission. Colonized people were framed as lacking the qualities or attributes necessary for a happy state of existence. Almost the same, but not quite. Almost the same, but not white. Almost happy, but not quite. The Chinese Communist Party state continuously and strategically invokes China's past and partial colonization, which it refers to as the period of national humiliation. And this continues through different periods and different leaderships until today. It portrays citizens like Robin at the same time as lacking in civility and equality, as in need of modern upgrade. And only if Chinese citizens like Robin can accomplish this, then the nation will be redeemed, right? That's sort of the rhetoric tied to this period of national humiliation discourse. So the entrepreneurial factory, then I argue, positions certain people in certain spaces as the right prototypes, as the right citizens who get to implement China's so-called indigenous innovation economy, the Chinese dream, the happy nation, the nation that China and its leaders and its citizens can be proud of. And of course, the models for this, for instance, are the kinds of men depicted here side by side, Premier Li Keqiang, and the kind of people who are supposed to model themselves after this image are people like Robin. So I argue that it was via the appropriation of making by the CCP and the associations with happiness and sort of promise that were attached to making, it was that this appropriation of making, it was that appropriation that allowed the CCP to pitch itself as, so to say, acting in the interest of the people, as committed to people's pursuits of happiness. So in other words, in this particular case, the Chinese party state appears as a benevolent, optimistic peer, so to say, of the people, who works right in step with people's dreams and aspirations and their hopes for justice. Under Xi Jinping in particular, this pursuit of happiness, feminist scholar Chia Yang shows us, has been rendered as a moral imperative for the so-called quality citizen. So the CCP, which is more typically, of course, especially in a Western context, associated with top-down authoritarian control, governs select groups of its citizens through this promise of happiness, through this promise of transformation. So happiness might be granted, in other words, if and only if people like Robin find ways on their own to go out to places like Ethiopia on behalf of the nation, to work alongside the party state and its ambitions of infrastructural upgrade to reposition China globally as a new and promising nation. So I'll just now offer some concluding thoughts, and then I'm excited for your questions and for our conversation. So the idea that China constitutes a place to prototype alternatives to existing models of modern technological progress would have sounded absurd to most people 10 years ago, when I started the research that has informed this book. This, of course, is less so the case more recently. Western China commentators and news media have variously proliferated a sense that we're witnessing the rise of an emboldened China, so one that more forcefully and assertively demands that the world, and the West in particular, ought to take it seriously as an equal or even threatening player in the global political economy and in technology innovation in particular. And indeed, some have speculated that the 21st century will be China's century. And more recently, of course, this is often framed again through the sort of narrative of threat, right, to a Western liberal democracy. My book complicates these narratives of what the historian Gabriel Hecht calls rupture talk. The notion of rupture, I argue, cannot explain China's current moment, nor the ideals of the maker movement. Indeed, rupture talk actually renders invisible the contingencies between older and ongoing dreams of China as an alternative model or a prototype nation, and the rise and spread of the promise of making. So the prototype nation, the book really attends to these otherwise often occluded contingencies of colonial pasts that reproduce China as a prototype nation. So for instance, I've shown today that the ideals and practices of the maker movement and the sort of imagination of a quote unquote new China were produced together, sort of co-created, co-produced one another amidst a broadening suspicion of the tech industry. So this tenacity then of technological promise in this very moment of a broadening critique of the tech industry, I argue, really depended on the select recruitment of once excluded bodies and sites. So in the entrepreneurial factory, certain forms of life are subsumed under capital production while others are continuously excluded. It is in these exclusions, however, that we can also find gaps in the seemingly smooth operation of venture capital investment and finance operations and finance capitalism. I channel here the feminist anthropologist Anna Tsing, who reminds us that if we end the story with decay, we abandon all hope or turn our attention to other sites of promise and ruin, promise and ruin. As a feminist ethnography, Prototype Nation specifically focuses and pays attention to the labor, the bodies, the places, and the instruments that were necessary to cultivate and maintain entrepreneurial life, like the happiness labor that I've described today. I argue that if we pay attention to this form of labor, it becomes clear that the entrepreneurial factory is actually not inevitable, but that it has to be nurtured and constantly maintained. And of course, if we then see it as something that has to be nurtured, if we notice that form of labor, then we also realize that we can change it, that the relationship between technology and markets can be different, can be otherwise. This requires us to really think about resistance differently, and really think about resistance beyond these familiar images of the countercultural hacker who attacks and tears down the system and builds something in its place. Throughout the book, and especially in chapter 5, I document the ambiguous and complicit acts of resistance that happiness workers engaged in. It was in their seeming futility, in their non-compliance with pitching, wherein we can notice also a gap in this functional alignment of dreaming better futures and the anticipatory logics of finance capitalism. And with this hopeful note, I would like to end and thank you all so much for your attention, for being here remotely today at either an early or late time of the day. Here's some information about how you can reach me. And I now very much look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Silvia, for this wonderful talk. I wonder if anybody wants to ask questions first, or I could just jump in with some of my own questions. But I would just let the audience decide first. Yeah, maybe when people are still thinking, I could just just share some of my thoughts. Especially, I
think
find...
I saw a hand up. Did Jack?
Oh.
Did you have a hand up?
Really? Okay. Yes, Jack, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll go first. Sorry, Yichen, but it's okay. Yeah. So my name is Jack, and I'm currently a PhD student in Georgia Tech, working on things related to platform economy, gig economy, etc. in China. So firstly, thanks very much for this presentation, as well as the book. I think it's quite innovative in that book that you really combine the post-colonial theories and studies with the Chinese case. I mean, this is still very rare because, of course, many works about China kind of use these set of post-colonial theory, but either in a way that providing a big background of China's humiliating history, or just creating a new concept of innovation, saying that, okay, now we can use this to challenge the Western-centric one. But yours one is that you really combine all these theory with your very detailed empirical observations. I think that's really a big thing ahead. So I really admire it, and thanks very much for that. So I mainly have a question about this so-called, maybe not, but I just frame it like this way: the generalizability of your story because your empirical focus is very unique. It's about a maker movement, about more grassroots, kind of a self-entrepreneurship type of like grassroots innovation in China. But for some people who are not familiar with this site, what they see more about technological innovation in China are more about, like, for example, big tech firms like Tencent, like Alibaba, etc. And many ordinary programmers work in those companies, and many platform workers or people like gig workers, etc. They are working for or they're using those platforms. So it seems that the people that I described are more present in people's daily life in China. So I wonder how your story about these makers are linked to like these, for example, programmers, platform workers, etc. Yeah, that's my own question. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jack, for these very kind remarks and for engaging with my work. I really appreciate it, and hope we can have many more conversations in the future also. Yeah, this is a really great question. Thank you. Because often we think of these kinds of spaces, sort of the more grassroots kind of tinkering spaces, as existing somewhat separate, right, from the more big tech corporate players. And what is very important to note here is that people circulate between these spaces. So many of the people, and this is not just true for China, this is true for a lot of these spaces in many regions, is that you know, people who hang out in these kinds of community spaces, many of them are fairly privileged. You know, these are not like migrant workers who need to make a living urgently. These are people who often have higher education and who have time to hang out in these spaces. So you will often find former Google employees or former Tencent employees in these kinds of spaces, or people who, you know, try out a startup and then it doesn't work and then they go back to work in these big tech industries. And in fact, many of the people I met who either went through these incubator programs or people who set up makerspaces, they would then actually pitch their expertise to big tech companies, but even to big manufacturers, by saying, look, I've done, my startup didn't succeed, but I've learned a lot by working in Shenzhen. I've learned a lot by partnering with factories, by running a business, by drawing investment funding. So actually the experience itself, even if it remained maybe on a small scale, allowed them to build careers in big tech companies, right? So even though we often think of these spaces as separate, they're actually quite intertwined.
Yeah, thanks very much for that answer. Yeah, that reminds me a lot about like I mean, mobility is a kind of a privilege. So there's some of the people in your story and the maker movement are more mobile than others because they're able to change their size from makerspace to big companies, etc. But maybe other people, for example, those migrant workers, those who use the platform to make a living, may not have that privilege. Yeah, that reminds me a lot. Thanks so much for that answer.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that, right? Because so a lot of and this is why it was important for me to tell the story of Robin also in this talk today, because I met so many, especially young men who come from a more rural background and who've made actually a successful career in industrial production, but they really felt like this shift that had happened in Shenzhen, the sort of upgrading of the city into this more incubator, makerspace-like environment, excluded them. They didn't feel comfortable in these spaces. They felt like they didn't quite belong. It wasn't sort of their cultural milieu. They didn't know how to speak that language, right? The incubator program trains people to learn how to talk in a particular way, right? How to pitch yourself as a startup. And it's this kind of international language, right? That these programs train people in. And yet they were held up, these spaces were seen by these young men as kind of spaces they aspired to, right? They wanted to eventually end up there, right? They were associated with, this is what the nation is proud of, this is what it means to be a quality citizen. And so that sort of model also led many of these men to accept this kind of stereotyping and racism that they experienced, because they hoped eventually they would overcome it, right? There was this promise eventually they might end up in these kinds of spaces.
Okay, I think Joe has the next question.
Hi, Silvia. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I have a question
Hi,
following
Joe.
up since you on Robin. Hi, Silvia. I wanted the clarification of why you argue that Robin is a case of upgrading. In a sense, when he's going to Ethiopia, he's going to another less developed country, more low tech, and it sort of reminds me of a lot of the Taiwanese shoe manufacturers who went to China and were then accused of not of upgrading, but of actually just continuing to do low tech kind of work. And in fact, it makes me think of Robin's justification. It reminds me of Lisa Hoffman's idea of patriotic professionalism, where he's arguing that he's doing this for the nation, but in fact, it looks like he's just taking the kind of low-tech work that the entrepreneurs have been doing in China and doing it in a less developed country where the labor is cheaper. So can you explain a little bit better why you see this as a case of upgrading?
Yes, yeah, no, thank you for that, it's so good to see you again. So for Robin, and I tried to show this a little bit in the images with maybe I can go back to that since I'm still screen sharing, actually, slide sharing. So let me go to that image of his career transformation. So this is his office 2 years later, after he went to Africa and started sort of the production site there. And you can see how modern it looks, right? It's in this high-rise building, and it's very glamorous especially, and Robin was very, very proud to show me this. This is how it looks from the outside. And his office beforehand looked like this. So this was just 2 years prior, right? And it was at the outskirts of the city. This is outside of Shenzhen, where a lot of the manufacturing actually does take place, right? And these neighborhoods are often quite dirty, and these offices aren't really sort of international representative office spaces. Whereas this new office that Robin then was able to afford was much more similar to this kind of international entrepreneurship model that also the state was celebrating, right? So yes, I think you're totally correct to observe that actually going to Africa is not per se, like just going there and then maybe not making it is not necessarily leading to this transformation, right? So there's that pressure you have to make it, right? You can't just go there, because it's and because it would be different if you went to Europe, right? Or if you went to the United States, so and many of the Robin too, and many of these the people I met, would both speak about the kind of racism they experience in Africa, but they also often express quite a bit of stereotyping about Africa, how it's dangerous, how it's dirty, and how people are lazy and things like that, right? So there was sort of this ambiguity there about what it meant in terms of their own status to go. But in the case of Robin, he did transform himself, in part at least, into that entrepreneur who could now afford that office, who could be seen in these spaces, and yet he still felt like, he wasn't quite treated the same way. So that's why he was saying, I still need to fight, I still need to do all this work, I still, cannot rest. And yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's clear. The office is a very good a sign of what you're getting at. Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm seeing every hand up or if I might not be seeing everyone.
I think Loretta has a question.
Hi, can you hear me? I just unmuted myself. Hi, Silvia. My name is Loretta Lowe. I am an anthropologist based at Durham University in the UK. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I've learned a lot. So like Jack, I also find it really refreshing that you bring in the post-colonial theory in these studies, and I just think it's a really interesting lens, and it's convincing also, especially hearing your response about how these young men think about how they are not just copycat, but they can actually make things. But at the same time, I wonder how these perspectives, or I'm not saying like how your application of this theory in this study, but also this discourse in general fit into the kind of nationalistic discourse in China at the moment. So that's my first question. And the second question is, I think in one of the earlier slides, you've mentioned about the framing of the makers movement in the West, if I remember correctly, is in the West, is often seen as like a type of, I think you've said that it's a like type of neoliberal governance. So I myself sometimes find that currently everything that focuses on the self is framed that way, is seen as a type of neoliberal subjectivity. So my own research looking at individuals' adoption of sustainability practice, and I often hear people ask questions like, oh, this is just neoliberal subject, as if they are, they just do it as part of the neoliberal governance without their own agency. So I wonder if there's any way of thinking about this focus on the self, making things, self-actualization, not in that frame, but something else. I don't have an answer. It's just opening up to. Yeah. So 2 questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Loretta. Well, maybe I'll start with that second question, and then we'll go to the first question about post-colonial sort of lenses and how it might be adjacent, similar to what the CCP itself is saying, which is an interesting topic. So, I mean, I've worked really hard in the book to be very careful around how I use or draw from sort of a lens of neoliberal processes. I think what often happens is that people rely on, and I think this is what Loretta, I think you're alluding to, is that people rely on neoliberalism as an explanatory frame, right? So people would say, this is neoliberalism, right? And then they don't explain why is neoliberalism or how is neoliberalism. They just say it's bad or it's there, right? And it explains everything, and that really doesn't help us understand, right, processes of governance. It doesn't help us understand the workings of the political economy. What I've been really hoping to do in the book is to show how, in my case, it's this focus on this promise of the entrepreneurial life, right, which centers the self as a sort of asset, both for the state or for the investor, how that is produced. So how was it possible that something that was understood as actually bringing about social justice, so the maker movement was really celebrated and was really enticing, including for many scholars, including many of us, we were really interested in the maker movement 12 years ago or 14 years ago now, because it was very similar to feminist approaches in computing, and it took up a lot of these kinds of ideas, right? And so what was very important for me to show is how did that happen? That's something that was understood through these value systems of collective action, of social justice, of collectivizing people, like that carried these kinds of notions. How did that end up then reducing people to competing against one another, pitching against one another, thinking of themselves in these terms of assets? And maybe a more concrete example is that, and I talk about it in one of the chapters in the book, that a lot of the startups in this incubator program where I was embedded in as an ethnographer, they started out with ideas that were really revolutionary in that sense that they were committed to social change. They were committed to justice projects. And they were literally trained over the course of the program to unthink that, to move away from collective we towards thinking of themselves as these entrepreneurial agents who present themselves as assets for the investor, right? So I show that process of how it's literally a training process. And it's important for us to show that this is something that is trained, because then we understand, well, it doesn't have to be this way. Neoliberalism is not something that just exists. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's not inevitable. This sort of turning people from collective actors, individual actors, is a process that requires education, that requires labor. And if we see that process, we can then also intervene in it. So that's a big commitment of the book. And I'm always very I'm always very hesitant and critical when people just rely on neoliberalism as an explanatory frame. I think that's really not constructive and doesn't teach us a lot. Okay, so your first question, and maybe you need to tell me a little bit more details of what you mean, but I think what you meant there was to say, so so if we look at someone like Robin and analyzing some of these struggles of this aspiration to upgrade himself, this pushback in some ways on the one hand against these Western stereotypes that someone like him would be inherently uncreative, on the one hand pushing back against that, and on the other hand yearning to be seen that way, right? So one of my key attempts was to really speak to that contradiction. But of course, as I discussed today in the talk, and I think as you're alluding to, the Chinese party state itself has appropriated a lot of these kinds of aspirations in its own rhetoric, right? And this is where I think it's actually really important to understand how the party state discourse has become much more approachable and is actually appropriating quite a bit from sort of everyday citizenry and the kind of aspirations that people have. So I think what you were asking was, is there sort of a complicity, right, in an analysis that pushes us to think about how Robin is both sort of resisting sort of Western stereotypes, but also as an analyst, as a scholar, to challenge sort of the Western stereotyping, right? As the CCP itself is like calling out the West for doing this kind of racial stereotyping or undermining China for its supposed inability to be an innovator. And I think there's not an easy answer, because governments and especially the Chinese government, as I just said, have become very savvy at appropriating these various sort of discourses and aspirations. So I talk at length in a book about how the Chinese state is drawing on sort of colonial history, right, to make a sort of very similar move to a post-colonial studies lens, right, of saying, look, there's harm in colonial history, there's colonial history that's still present with us today. So I think what is important for us to do as critical scholars is to both shed light on how a powerful entity like the CCP is appropriating colonial pasts, while still also, including that into our analysis, while still also tracing to how, yes, colonial pasts do operate in the present moment, including in how the CCP is taking it up, right? So I think it's important to do both, right? To show there's a deliberate political uptake and point in doing that, right? And yet that still requires of us to make that post-colonial move, right? To show how these paths continue to operate, especially in spaces that are understood as kind of innovative, forward-looking spaces that seemingly have nothing to do with colonial histories or histories of racism or imperialism. Loretta, does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
Absolutely, very eloquently, thank you. I guess just a very quick follow-up question is, how does the nationalistic discourse, because I do see that there are some parallels, and you've explained it very eloquently just now, how they kind of interact with each other, but at the kind of grassroots level among the makers, do you hear it being kind of incorporated into some kind of nationalism?
Not in this particular network of the maker sort of open source hardware crowd. I see these expressions of nationalism more taken up broadly in the tech industry in China now. So I see it a little bit. The maker scene is still so whimsical, kind of an alternative and very sort of international, people networking across regions. And I was just recently in Yunnan because I escaped the Shanghai lockdown earlier in March, and was lucky enough to spend some time in Yunnan, and then lived in a rural part of Dali. And in Dali, I met a lot of people who, I met some people who had met 10 years ago in Beijing, who were building countercultural internet systems in Beijing and who are now in Dali, and so there is, so it's this kind of crowd, that seeks alternative, to build alternative technological structures that challenge the status quo. And I think you still have that commitment, and that's not a nationalistic narrative at all. But I think you see the sort of drift into nationalism more with the bigger tech companies and in places, maybe now like Shanghai and Beijing, right? Sort of these more countercultural values have escaped these big cities a little bit, I think.
Thank you so much. So interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I see several hands up. Should I be calling Yichen, or are you calling on people?
I think June raised her hand first. June, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I should probably refer you to someone who actually just spoke to me 3 weeks ago from a big international company, asking me about the future of China's technological tech industry. I probably should tell the person to talk to you for more concrete information about it. Thank you for a very
yes, please do.
wonderful talk. So I'm very curious, since you talk about these makers and technological innovations, I'm very curious about what kind of technological products are we talking about here? So how are we going to, how we place them in the, let's say, the global supply chain? So which level we are talking about? So it's still, for example, the kind of, like in Robin's case, the kind of products that he produces, is it like Apple, in which the over 70% of the profits goes to US, Japan, and I think the other one I forgot, primarily US and Japan, and then China, even though, most of the cell phone says assembly in China, but China probably takes less than 1% of the total profit. So intellectual property, of course, plays a very important role. So one thing is, when you're talking about this kind of technological innovation providing hope, I'm very curious what kind of technologies we are talking about, how much profits that they can actually generate. So it's still the so-called high-tech kinds that they can actually extract a lot of profit, or they still a little bit of the low-tech, however, labor-intense kind. So in that, it relates to my second question is, I'm sure that you heard about it in China. There's a term that existed for a long time. It's called 山寨品. Yeah, 山寨品. If actually sometimes you look at some of the 山寨产品, basically they're copycats. But actually a lot of the copycat have their little bit of the innovations. They actually have a small modifications. I remember in some of the cell phone, for example, some kind of a low-end cell phone, they actually were the first ones to adopt so-called double SIM card, long before Apple or even other bigger companies started to use that technology, because they are actually, well, for the convenience for people, many of Chinese citizens use double SIM cards because of the price comparisons. So I want to hear what you think about those 山寨, that kind of a 山寨innovation, 山寨 technological dreams. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of my book chapters is dedicated to this very question, where I write about Shanghai production and its history and its also celebration in the international maker community. So what drew a lot of makers and people who were active in that scene to Shenzhen in the years following the financial crisis was because they saw Shenzhen not just as a site of mass manufacturing, but a site of a city-size sort of counterculture, and Shanghai practice was exactly why, right? So as you were saying, you know, many people would associate with Shanghai not just the negative connotations of copycat, but especially the foreign makers would celebrate Shanghai as a unique form of innovation, as a unique form of counterculture that was kind of mass production counterculture, you know, with these no brand, no name kind of devices intervening in global markets, right? When you think about even Xiaomi or Technomobile, some of these big brands that have come out of the Shanghai industry, who are now, you know, brands both in China and in markets like in Latin America or in Africa, right? People would point to these examples and say, look, this is intervention in sort of global supply chains, but also in monopoly, like in like Nokia, you know, was replaced by a lot of these Shanghai, grown out of Shanghai kind of brands, right? So in chapter 3 of the book, I analyzed both Shanghai and I spend a lot of time with design solution houses and manufacturing houses who operate in this Shanghai industry, but I also I talk about their work practices and how indeed it's actually a big industry, it's big profit for many of them, but I also talk about how Shanghai was celebrated in sort of this in the arts, not just in the maker scene, but also in the arts and design, and how Shanghai was often portrayed as, yes, it's sort of countercultural, it's sort of innovative, but it still kind of lags behind Western innovation. So people would say kind of these things, they would argue, oh, you know, it's really interesting, it's kind of it's hacking hardware, but it can't compete with Silicon Valley because it doesn't really do software, it doesn't do data, right? So they would find these sort of arguments to, on the one hand, celebrate Shanghai, but then also portray it as something that was a practice that was still not quite as modern, still not quite as innovative as Silicon Valley. So I talk about that contradiction of how it's on the one hand celebrated and yet still portrayed as through a sort of trope of lacking and lagging. So yeah, I invite you to check out chapter 3 of the book where I talk more about that. And what I meant with like hope, you know, the sort of hopeful project is not so much the hope about products, you know, and of course the margin, the profit margin is now much higher in manufacturing for the production of our phones than it used to be. But what I mean by hope is more like these kinds of what I talk about in chapter 4 and 5 of the book, when people actually push back against some of these processes of economization, where they resist these sort of micro acts of resistance. I build on the anthropologist James Scott here and his analysis of weapons of the weak, but I apply it specifically to this context of female Chinese workers and their sort of very ambiguous acts of resistance that often didn't even appear as resistance because they weren't like, let's tear down the system and you know, and tear down the workings of the incubator. That's not what they look like. So what I mean by hope is to pay attention to that, right? Rather than attaching ourselves to product development. So. Okay, I see several more hands up. I'm not sure who was first.
Yeah,
or what the order is.
Gonzalo and then Yang and then Jack.
Okay, Gonzalo.
Okay, so it's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Silvia. This was great. Yeah, I mean, very wide-ranging, very stimulating, mixing and bringing together different kinds of theoretical approaches. Some colleagues mentioned post-colonial theory, also feminist approaches, very interesting, STS. So that was very stimulating. I think I have a question. And it's a question about the longer narrative curve of your story. I mean, I was very much persuaded by the argument you make about China emerging as some kind of contested sort of alternative model of innovation. In the follow-up the financial crisis, right? That sort of in that kind of period sort of made sense because, all kinds of critiques were emerging globally and so on and so forth. So the idea of looking for an alternative certainly made a lot of sense. But what I'm sort of interested as well is that the historical moment that you're talking about from a Chinese perspective, if I would sort of look for a word to capture it, I would probably use the term bubble, right? There was a bubble in the making, right? I mean, there was a bubble in the making coming from the turn of the millennium up to the early 2010s. That was the moment in which all the promises of the new economy, of the China dream, were being really, really fulfilled to many people. But after 2015, a few years later, 2019, we start to have debates about 996, right? Open debates. We start to have big discussions about sort of overwork culture, the tech sector as a highly exploitative sector. Jack Ma comes to the fore and says, echoing the maker movement, entrepreneurial life is a blessing, not for individuals, of course, for employees, right? Because that's what he means. Individuals for him are employees. But I wonder, if you were to continue your narrative curve, past 2015 up to the present, say, post 2019, 996 debates, even perhaps speculating, although it's hard for anybody to speculate anything about China these days, but at least up until 2019, right? If you were to speculate what has, the impact of these new developments, of the rise of these more pessimistic kind of culture, perhaps some signs of the bubble starting to burst, what would you say? I mean, do you have any sort of follow-up ethnographic analytical insights on what happened post 2015?
Sure, thank you, Gonzalo, for that question. Well, I think we should actually start with the bubble, right, for our purposes here. So actually, a lot of the makers back then would refer to it as a wave. They would say we're riding a wave. So, and we don't know where it's going. It might break tomorrow, or it might last. We don't know. But there was definitely this feeling of exuberant excitement, right? Of possibilities, of change. And I would say, especially before 2012, right? There was really this sort of notion also of a perhaps more open tech environment in China, which of course then began shifting also with Xi Jinping. So, but yeah, it was so especially in those years, 2008, 9, 10, 11, was sort of this moment of excitement. So what I'm trying to show in the book, and this takes us to the present then, is to show very much so how exactly this sort of these feelings that were produced of promise, of exuberant excitement, of possibilities, actually masked already back then the very problems that are now intensified. So there was so much overwork that was legitimized in these kinds of networks at that time. People built these spaces, they committed free labor, they even invested their own money in those years, right? And it was all seen as part of what you had to do in order to make this project happening, because it felt so exciting, right? So I'm really, and this, so now what we see with 996 is sort of an intensification of that, right? You could almost say what was prototyped in 2010 and 11, this sort of precarious form of life in the name of building an optimistic, forward-looking tech industry in China, basically succeeded in that sense, right? In that sense that it proliferated the precarious work, the overwork, the exhaustion, this demand put on people to take on responsibilities, right? So we now people are critiquing it much more, right? But back then it was, and exactly because it was celebrated back then so much, is what actually enabled its proliferation. So this is where I draw on affect theory quite a bit in the book, to show how these productions of positive feelings And the government, of course, uses it very deliberately as well, with sort of Zhengnang Liang and sort of this notion of positive energy, right? Creating positive energy and positive feelings about China and its future, right? How this producing of positive feelings is actually a form of violence, because it often then normalizes and hides various forms of exploitation. And of course, 996, I think, is just an extension from that, right? So for me, it was very depressing in some ways to come back to China in the years of 2007 and 2018, because what I saw in terms of female, like Chinese women working in the tech industry, what I observed in these foreign-funded incubator programs, that had become much more normalized, right? This form of happiness labor, and had become much more pervasive, and the overwork as well. So I think it's, in that sense, it was depressing, right? Because I was like, yeah, just to see it sort of on a much broader scale and normalized that way is, of course, what we would hope wouldn't happen, right? And something that we are all eager to intervene in. But yeah, I think in order to understand where we are now, we do have to understand these historical moments where there is very little attention to the exploitative side of the tech industry. And we can look back, of course, this was the case in the US as well, the 1990s, right? The sort of this moment of the countercultural revolution, right? And tech now everyone thinks of Facebook or Meta as like an evil company. But back in the 2000s, it was celebrated as enabling, Twitter and Facebook were celebrated as enabling revolutions, right? And I argue in the book that these kinds of promises of justice and social change, they do work in that sense that they mask the very exploitation that these tech environments then normalize. Does that connect the past and present?
Absolutely. No, it's fascinating. Yeah. But I think we still have 2 more questions at least each on.
Okay.
Yes. I think
last questions, I think. Yeah.
We are. Yeah, our enthusiasm in the audience has get us running out of time. So I would suggest that we collect a few questions in the end, and then to have Silvia to give a kind of a concluding feedback. So I would
so
also
can we
use
do this in 5 minutes,
my own question.
Please?
Yeah. I would just do a quick question too, following up on 996, because Gonzalo, Jack, Jing, and I wrote a chapter on that, and then we interviewed people who work in the IT industry and understand their thoughts about 996. And I realized there's a very interesting thing about the contested imaginaries of the West when it relates to, the whole striving ethos in the IT industry. So, for example, people look at the Europe, and Europe has a very kind of cozy work style that was being, featured as a comparative work ethos. And then people would say that, Europe is already laid back. We have to see forward like the States, like the United States. And people in the Silicon Valley are still striving hard. So I was wondering, in your study, maybe it's a few years earlier, do people have this contested thinking about the West? Because when you're talking about the West, you actually you could be referring to very different cultures. And then I would let Yang and maybe Jack to have their questions.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I have actually 3 questions, but I try to be quick. So my first question would be the hierarchy between these foreign incubators, investors with these people in China, such as lobbying. So do they have like a hierarchical relationship, as you suggest? And so your main focus is this kind of network of this maker movement, or you particularly focus on this entrepreneurs such as Robin, who is actually making the manufacturing work? And this is the first question. And the second question is about the name of the book, which is called a prototype. So I was wondering, do you suggest that the prototyping nation, the prototype is kind of illusion which is kind of believed or people trying to promote it by something like, you mentioned about Li Keqiang, about this entrepreneurial movement, and you also mentioned about this makers themselves, people who participate in this maker movement, but also these foreign investors. Do three actors come together trying to promote this idea of protest, or trying to envision this kind of very optimistic vision of a nation or new land in terms of the settler colonialism sense. So do you suggest that you want to suggest us to think in the opposite way, to think this more critically and trying to thought about whether or not this is actually so optimistic as it seems to be? And then my last question about, you mentioned about Dali and people who actually have this idealistic kind of, or even anarchist, digital anarchist kind of thing. I was also very interested in this group of people, especially people who are participating in the Web3 movement, because they're starting to think about the Web3 as a replacement of the utopian vision of the Web 2. And so they actually was drawn by this idea of the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organizations. So I wonder whether you have any insights into whether, do you think this is also another idealistic bubble, not the bubbling in terms of economy, but the bubbling in terms of the idealism, whether this was coming to become something like the thing you reported as in graphically as well. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll try to be fast. How much time do we have? Like a couple minutes?
Yeah, just take your time. I think if the audience are okay, we'll just, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for these questions. So I'll start with Yi-Chen's first about sort of these images about the West and how they're shifting. And I think that's a really interesting question, right? Especially with these very rapidly intensifying geopolitical relations between Europe and China and the US and China. And so I've seen attitudes shift quite a bit over the last few years. And this is also just personal experience, how I came back to China a year ago. I'm in a quarantine hotel right now. A year ago, I was also in a quarantine hotel. When I arrived a year ago, the mood was very, very different in China than it is now, especially in Shanghai. Shanghai had this data-driven approach to COVID-0, and China, like a lot of people I met, it felt like was on top of the world. It had defeated COVID. I felt like a lot of expression of nationalistic sentiments, and there was this sort of national pride and optimism, but an optimism that was very different from the kind of optimism that I observed 12 years ago. And so certainly I've been witnessing, and this is not just in sort of the networks of the tech industry, but broadly where the West wasn't with, often in the past, as Yi-Chen, I think you were referring to, Silicon Valley was often seen as this kind of, prototype model, right? Something to learn from or to point towards, right? And I heard much less of that. There was much more the sort of critical, like critique, and even sort of like building on the West's own critique of its own tech industries, right? So that was it. So it was interesting to see the uptake of like people being very critical also of 996 here, right? And sort of pointing to the West as a partner in crime, so to say. So that's what I personally witnessed. But it's really important. It's so difficult to study, I think. So I'm really curious what you've been finding in that space, because it's shifting. So the attitude now that I'm back, I was here in China over the last year, but just being in this quarantine hotel again made me look at my field notes from a year ago of how I was thinking about my arrival, my return after 2 years of pandemic life in America. And now the mood is so much more subdued, and there's, people feel more pessimistic in China, right? And so you see that also affect how people talk about the West, right? And how people talk about technology. So, but it's very difficult, I find, for researchers right now to trace that, because it's so rapidly shifting and the mood is sort of affected so I feel like it's going in these waves, you know. So anyway, I would love to have more conversations about this. It's a really interesting question. Okay, and then Young's 3 very provocative and interesting questions. I feel like I should just pick one because otherwise we're gonna be here for a while. So maybe you and I can have a conversation about the anarchists and the DAO and Web3 and DALI, because I did see some of that and I'm very interested in it. So if you want to talk more about that, let's do that. And I do think there's a repetition in some ways of some of these earlier countercultural ideas through Web3, but yet there's also a recognition that the earlier the earlier ideals haven't panned out, and so there's much ambiguity that I find fascinating. And so your question about how was it possible that these different actors came together, the CCP, the investor and the maker, how did they all come together in this sort of, you know, sort of this building of a prototype, or this promise of the prototype, of prototyping, and is it an illusion, or is it? So this is why I use the word promise, and I build on Sarah Ahmed's notion here of the promise of happiness, and because it seems on first glance, it seems counterintuitive, right? Why would the CCP, often associated with much more sort of top-down authoritarian structures of governance, why would they do something or take something up that is associated with grassroots hacking and sort of countercultural ideals? And why would big investors, Silicon Valley type investors, endorse the same thing? So it seems counterintuitive. And the project of the book was really to show how that happened. How did these different actors, who are on the surface level so drastically opposed, how did they end up coming together in this? And in the end, actually propagating something that arguably betrayed some of these earlier visions of countercultural intervention and building more just technology environments, right? And so I used the analytical lens of the promise to unpack this, right? How idealists, like technological idealists, got on board because they felt like this kind of hacker environment can, on the one hand, enable them to push back against these Western-centric notions that Chinese people are just endlessly copycatting, right? So there was this promise for them to recuperate Chinese tech innovation and creativity. And then the government appropriated that for its own purposes, because of course it's, you know, very invested in pushing back against the Western-centric narratives about China. So again, I use this sort of drawing from affect theory and this notion of the promise to show how these different sites and actors came together. And I know that you had another question, but I want to be mindful of people's time. So also, Yang, feel free to reach out, you know, per email or otherwise, and we can talk more about these things. Thank you. These were such great questions and so stimulating.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Silvia, again, for this wonderful and very rich sharings. And for, you know, thank the audience for this very interactive engagements. So I would want to end with announcement of our next talk in this series. The next talk will be on November 17th, 2022. The topic is population aging and medical robotics, an exploration of robot-assisted rehabilitation in South Korea by Seong-Sam Na from Yonsei University College of Medicine. So let's give a final warm applause to Professor Lindtner.
Thank you so much, Silvia. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a delight, and I really appreciated all your wonderful, thoughtful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.